Welcome to Ryan's Running Reviews in partnership with Roadrunner Sports, and today we're taking a look at the Asics GT-2012. We're also going to compare it to last year's version to see what changed, and we also have the Asics Gel Kayano 30 because this is basically the larger, thicker version of the GT-2000. Got a lot to talk about here. Let's run with it. Now, before we get started, I do want to say these shoes were provided to me by Roadrunner Sports. However, I don't have a chance to preview this video, and this file synopsis is my own. I'd also like to say please leave a like on the video and consider subscribing. Here we go. The GT-2000 series is Asics' moderately cushioned stability running shoe. It's essentially the stability counterpart to the Gel Cumulus, which is Asics' flagship neutral daily trainer. And it's great for people who want some guidance without having to have such a large midsole like we see here on the Gel Kayano 30. There's also the GT-1000, which is essentially the budget version of the GT-2000. I realize that's a little bit confusing, but I hope that makes sense. This shoe costs $140 and does lose a little bit of weight. Last year on version 11, it came in at 9.7 ounces, and this year we're down to 9.5, which is pretty good for a stability shoe in this category. We also get a few more millimeters in the way of stack height, so thicker midsole and less weight, always a nice combination. On version 11, we had 31 and 23, and this year it's going to be 36 and 28 for that same 8mm drop. And if we compare that to the Kayano 30, this comes in at over an ounce heavier, weighing at 10.7 ounces. However, this sucker has 40mm in the heel and 30 in the forefoot for a 10mm drop. So if it's just the thicker, heavier shoe with a 10mm drop compared to the GT-2000's 8mm drop. Moving on to the upper, we do have a slightly different kind of engineered mesh compared to what we saw last year on the version 11. Overall, about the same kind of fit. True to size, maybe a smidge narrow. The breathability was pretty average. However, if we compare it to the Kayano 30, I think the Kayano has a bit more volume to it, especially in the toe box. Just felt slightly more accommodating in my opinion. The tongue, however, has been completely redesigned. It's now incredibly thin with small bits of foam blocks kind of scattered throughout, give you some protection from lace pressure. I think it works fine, but it is noticeably less soft and plush compared to the very traditional tongue we're used to kind of seeing from Asics on most of their daily trainers. So it gets a little bit thinner. For me personally, on my running shoes, I don't mind this, but it may be an issue for some people who really do like that really soft, thick, plush tongue. Again, the new thin, updated tongue with the foam blocks didn't cause an issue. It is a different change or a move in a different direction, I'll say, from what Asics typically does on their running shoes, and the same thing goes for what we see here on the Kayano with its very thick and plush tongue. The other change I will say is last year we did not have a gusseted tongue, and this year the tongue is now gusseted, just like we saw here on the Kayano. Moving to the back of the shoe, we still have that incredibly stiff and rigid heel counter, which is an important part of a stability running shoe as it helps limit excess motion and connects you into the stability platform, which is the shoe is designed for. You also have a new elf ear pull tab. In my opinion, I wasn't a huge fan of this updated redesign. I felt like the lockdown on both last year's version and the Kayano with their more traditional heel counters worked better, and I had to kind of orient the lacing system to make sure I got a proper fit, which I did not have to do on the other two models. So overall, I think the upper works quite well. Feels like a very traditional Asics shoe, very similar to last year. The biggest difference is I wasn't a huge fan of the change to heel counter. It's had a little bit of heel lift, which was not an issue, again, on either of these other two running shoes. Moving on to the midsole, it has been completely redesigned this year. We'll start with last year's shoe so we can kind of see where we came from. There was a whole lot going on to this shoe. The white foam was Flight Foam Blast. The green foam was a dense, more firm material, which they called their Light Truss system, meant to kind of stabilize the back half of the shoe. And then you had that classic Asics gel on the lateral edge of the heel to help with shock absorption. And if that wasn't enough, they also include something called 3D space construction, which means as they construct the midsole, internally there are geometric shapes printed inside that collapse in a strategic way to give you even more stability. So that kind of explains the GT-2011, last year's edition, and I think it worked quite well. A very stable running shoe, and I was quite happy with it. But Asics went back to the drawing board and completely changed the stability technology and cushioning method here on the 12th edition. And now we have a full-length, consistent Flight Foam Blast Plus midsole, which is noticeably softer compared to the old Flight Foam Blast midsole we saw last year. Now, they also added something called Pure Gel, so there's no gel along the lateral edge of the heel. It's now directly underneath your heel, and they did the same thing with the Cumulus and the Kayano. You don't necessarily feel it when you step into this shoe, but it does give you an extra layer or an extra material between you and the ground. As you run, helps with the overall shock absorption. They also updated the stability mechanism. There's no 3D space construction, no geometric shapes inside the midsole like we saw last year, and I couldn't feel it, and I didn't see any of that being printed on the spec sheets or informational material, so I'm fairly certain the entire midsole is a very consistent layer of Flight Foam Blast Plus. They did, however, implement something called the 3D guidance system, which refers to the large beveled heel, the incredibly wide outsole, and this lateral flare along the top of the forefoot. And while those elements to the 3D guidance system absolutely help to the overall stability of this shoe, there are also some other things that I want to talk about that aid in just the overall ride and guidance. The first is, if you look on the lateral side of the heel, you'll notice you have some sculpting or kind of cutouts, if you will, which does not exist on the medial side, which means you have easier compression towards the lateral edge compared to the medial side, which means it keeps you from overpronating or rolling inwards. They also have kind of a mini foam guide rail on the lateral side, which keeps you very connected into the platform, which adds in the overall lockdown and stability of the midsole itself. So essentially, all those different components kind of work together to create a very stable ride. And it's very unique in the way that there's no medial post like we see here with the Kayano 30, which has a similar thing. You have lateral sculpting, so it's a little bit easier compression on the lateral side. However, here on the Kayano, you had this kind of dense bit of green foam, which kind of acts as almost like a medial support or medial arch posting, however you want to phrase it, which again, completely different compared to the GT-2000, which doesn't have anything underneath the arch. It's all just Flight Foam Blast Plus. So it's a slightly different stability methodology compared to the Kayano, and completely different if we compare it to last year's version, the GT-2011. The Kayano also shares a lot of similarities. It's a much thicker, much bulkier shoe. It also has full-length Flight Foam Blast Plus. It has those mini foam sidewalls, an incredibly wide base, and a large heel, and then you have the lateral flare and everything, and they call this the 4D guidance system, and that extra dimension, if you will, is basically just like we talked about before, this kind of green, bouncy, dense foam that gives you a little bit more medial support. So the long and short of it is this is 4D guidance system, and the GT-2000 is the 3D guidance system, with the biggest difference being that you don't have this medial kind of bouncy green foam for that extra medial support like you see here on the Kayano. Moving on to the outsole, we still have a ton of rubber coverage here, which is great for durability. And yes, you still have AHAR Plus in the heel, which is that more dense, more durable rubber. As far as the surface area goes, if you line these shoes up, they are pretty comparable, if not identical. So the total amount of outsole surface area remains unchanged, which is good to see for a stability shoe. And yes, we still have that rubber through the midfoot, which kind of stiffens things up and just gives the shoe even more stability. If we compare it to the Kayano does have slightly more surface area to it, especially through the midfoot, which makes sense as this shoe is bigger, bulkier, and has that same Flight Foam Blast Plus foam, which is very soft. So you need that wider base to help stabilize things. So there is a little bit of a wider surface area between the Kayano and the GT-2012. After trying this updated version, I will say it feels noticeably softer and, in my opinion, becomes a more versatile stability running shoe for a couple reasons. One, it gets a little bit lighter. It's also a little bit more flexible and bendable. And the other thing is that the stability mechanisms here aren't as intrusive. It honestly feels like a neutral running shoe with just a hint of stability added. With that being said, I think last year's version does feel more stable just because all of the foams here are more firm and you have some other technology that provides a much more strong feeling of guidance, if you will, compared to what we see here on the 12th version. I will say I do like the lockdown of the upper better on last year's version compared to this year, but it is much more comfortable with that full-length, consistent Flight Foam Blast Plus foam midsole. I'll also say I think the GT-2012 is more versatile compared to the Kayano 30, which comes in at over an ounce heavier. It does give you 4 more millimeters of stack height, however, it is noticeably bulkier. This is a great option for someone who likes the Nimbus but wants a little bit more guidance. That's where the Kayano comes in. And for someone who likes the Cumulus but wants a little bit more support, I think that's where the GT-2000 comes in. I really do like the Kayano. It feels incredibly comfortable. It's just rather heavy and bulky, at least in comparison to the GT-2000. Really like the shoe. Incredibly comfortable. I think it's a good upgrade. The only thing I don't like is kind of the fit of the heel counter. It's Elf-ear pull tab. Just not a big fan. I think the classic heel counter, like we see on most Asics shoes, works really well, and I'm very happy with that. I'm not sure why they changed it here. But other than that, I think this is a solid option if you get the lacing system and lockdown just right. I think it performs quite well. So let me know down in the comments, what do you think of this updated GT-2000, and do you like the direction that Asics is going with their stability running shoes? I would love to hear from you. Well, I'm Ryan from Ryan's Running Reviews, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Thanks.